We are the paradoxical ape. Bipedal, naked, large-brained, long the master of fire, tools, and language, but still trying to understand ourselves. Aware that death is inevitable, yet filled with optimism. We grow up slowly. We hand down knowledge. We empathize and deceive. We shape the future from our shared understanding of the past. CARTA brings together experts from diverse disciplines to exchange insights on who we are and how we got here. An exploration made possible by the generosity of humans like you.
Pretty extraordinary kind of range of work that I think we've seen, and the way in which these ideas kind of layer onto each other. You know, I think it was really incredible when we were seeing the Kenneth brothers, and you know, and you start to hear the kinds of the depth and complexity that is brought to the idea of how you could go about building a reconstruction. And you recognize that they're not only kind of just looking at, you know, trying to come up with a certain kind of physical fidelity based on, you know, best kind of practices, but that involves the development and thinking about all the other kind of factors that would go into, you know, what early human or other kind of hominid life might actually consist of. And then how the kind of aesthetic criteria goes into creating something that can actually engage our imagination as we look at it. And in all the work that I think we've heard about today, recognizing the necessity to be able to think actually very broadly across disciplines. Such that, you know, taking on a question like, you know, the human origins, you might come at it from a disciplinary expertise, but because you're entering into such unknown territory, you know, the vectors that you try to connect that are beyond the specifics that you bring to the question are the ones that possibly lead you to new kinds of answers about it. And so I hope people have been filling out the questionnaires and handing them to the edges of the aisles where our trusty helpers here are kind of gathering them. And now I think we're going to do some Q&A. And so Allison's going to start.
All right, I've been collecting the questions for the first part, and so the first question is for Karen. So the question is, how do you feel about pressure on teachers in elementary school grades, K, transitional K first, to eliminate play in class and emphasize academics? I think you have to come here. Yeah.
Good question, right? So this is very much a question that's being posed to developmental psychologists today all the time, right? There's all these new sort of academic pressures. Things are sort of getting pushed earlier and earlier. There's less and less time for sort of free exploratory kinds of activities, much more time spent on test preparation. I don't think that anyone would say that this is a good idea, per se. I mean, I think that what we have seen is that at least in the early school years, so in preschool in particular, preschools have completely adopted a play-focused emphasis. To you, this probably seems totally natural now because this is just the way that we live our lives. We've just assumed that play is precisely the work of this early childhood, and I think that now, with the sort of new science that's coming out showing that playful learning actually might continue, right, to have these sorts of benefits even later on, there's pressure being put on the education system to sort of combat the direction that we've gone in, which is this sort of college preparation that starts even as early as first grade. So it's bad, right? But it's hard, right? So it's a really difficult problem, and I do think that right now it's part of the conversation, and so it's certainly going to be adjusted.
Right. I have another one for you. So you said evidence of imagination can be seen as soon as infants can speak. Does neonatal imitation suggest that newborns imagine the existence of other people?
Ooh. Sorry. Neonatal imitation, does it suggest that they're imagining other people? I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know. I can't even speculate on that question, in fact. I'm not sure. No. So I think that generally what we think of as neonatal movements, right, there's an interaction, right, between touch sensation from the mother and neonatal movement, also to sound, right, and other kinds of sensory input. So they're reacting, right, in many ways to their tactile and sensory environment. But I don't think that we can speculate about imagination. We know that neonates learn, right? So they can be exposed to particular kinds of sounds, for example, in utero, and then afterwards show signs of recognizing those sounds in various learning contexts. There's some really interesting and ingenious ways of testing this. They also recognize the smell of fluids that were taken from the mother as well. And so there's recognition and there's learning that happens neonatally, but I don't know, I can't comment on imagination.
So I'll just take advantage that you are here. I'll ask you another one.
Okay.
How does a child counterfactual cognition change as he or she acquires language?
How does counterfactual cognition change as they acquire language, right? So it makes sense, right, that being able to think about alternative possibilities should be influenced by having abstract concepts, and language gives us those abstract concepts. So as we acquire more rich and complex language, we're also able to think of more rich and complex kinds of narratives, right? And so this, in part, probably explains some of the developmental changes that we see from very, very early sort of proto kinds of pretense, which is mostly just substituting one object for another, to the very elaborate kinds of pretense that we see in middle childhood and adolescence, where they're developing these societies that have their own systems of governance and rules and foods and clothing. I mean, it's really amazing, the work out there sort of documenting middle childhood and the kinds of paracosms that they create. And those things are dependent, of course, on a more mature language. And so it seems to me that there's a relationship there, yeah.
Okay, all right. I think that's all for you.
Okay, thank you guys so much.
Sheldon. So I have a couple for Sheldon. Why do people have different levels of imagination?
Well, you know, there's certainly a lot that might have that is attributable to the cultural and social upbringing and pressures. Whether or not there are underlying, neurological differences, that's maybe too murky, a thing that we haven't been able to explore yet. But there's so in a lot of educational theory, that are educational theories are changing always and evolving, and culturally you see these differences where some children are encouraged to imagine more and for longer periods of time, and in other cultures, it's like, childhood's over, get to work, kind of attitudes. And so some of this kind of spills over into, life in general as it's lived in adulthood. But even in those cases, you certainly always have the kind of counter examples of people who seem to go against the grain and have this kind of ongoing imaginative capacity. And so then sometimes there are these things like, where, everyone's an artist, everyone can do all this stuff. And I think that's also kind of an oversimplification of the cognitive differences that we have. So we're mentally very diverse species. And I think we should, we really should celebrate that diversity rather than think that everybody should be everything all the time.
But if you take science fiction writers from different cultures, is there something unique about them?
Well, you certainly see that. So he was asking if you take science fiction writers, which is a group of imaginative people that we spend some time talking with, and is there something different about them? Well, I think one thing that you see is that there are different ways in which they think about problems. And so there might be these kind of practices that they have cultivated or that they kind of naturally kind of gravitated to, which cause them to think about problems in ways that are more orthogonal to how those problems are typically approached. And it often means that they're kind of, really expand the context by which they place problems within. So they don't think of them quite so instrumentally from a single perspective. They are often kind of read across many different kinds of literatures or engage in many different kinds of discourses, so historical, scientific, humanistic, a bunch of different kinds of things. And then the work that they do comes up with a kind of original synthesis out of those many different elements. And so you start to see those kinds of characteristics. And then if the question is, well, why do they have them? That is a good question.
So another one for you here. I think, I'll simplify that, but is imagination really humans? Is it present in different animals? There are evidence that perhaps chimpanzees, even gorillas might have some kind of imagination. And in this same context, what about artificial intelligence? You can recreate, you can make a computer be creative or have innovation. Is it imagination?
Yeah, so, I kind of indicated a little bit in my talk, how much richer our theories of imagination can become when we consider the imaginative realms of the non-human. And, and this isn't to kind of, diminish the kind of unique capabilities of Homo sapiens. But I think we start to really expand our understanding of our own imaginations by trying to recognize what the kind of imaginative Umwelt is of other kinds of entities. And, and I gave just, some kind of cheeky little examples. But, to then consider, well, what is the imagination of a swarm of bees? The kind of that has both a kind of social dimension as well as an individual dimension is an interesting way to kind of think about then, how does that relate to what we consider our kind of social imagination? And then as it goes to this question of artificial intelligence, that, often, as I mentioned a little bit, when we start to approach the notion of constructing an artificial intelligence, we do so by thinking of it as modeling aspects of human intelligence or human imagination. Well, our models of that are our own understanding of what we're trying to model is very limited, fragmented, and emergent. And so to kind of think of that as the kind of beginning and end of what an artificial imagination could be is a terrible limitation on that possibility. And in fact, what we might find is the more kind of viable artificial imagination would be imagination that is as alien to the human imagination as that swarm of bees imagination is to the human imagination. So all of these things kind of, considering how we might, we need to continuously expand, our conceptions of what this kind of human phenomena is in relationship to the rest of the biosphere and the technosphere that we're in the process of building.
Okay. Augustine Fuentes, some questions for you. That's an interesting one. When it comes to imagination, why distinguish stone-chipped tools from a branch of stripped leaves?
So why I have pockets, so I can use my hands there. I'm going to go like this. What's the difference between stone tool? Chimpanzees will frequently, different communities of chimpanzees will take a branch, strip that branch of leaves, break it to an appropriate length, and then use it for fishing for termites or a variety of other things. Other chimpanzees will carry with them a small stripped branch that they really like. They'll walk for 20 minutes to another site where the termite den is, pick up a stick there, use that stick first to modify the termite, then use that secondary stick. Work by Cricket Sands and her colleagues have demonstrated that. So there's a lot of incredible, and then there's other, not just chimpanzees, crows, and a number of organisms that use sticks, modified sticks, in a simple way for tools. None of those require the level of multiple foresight and planning or structural and manual visual manipulation that making stone tools does. So it's too bad. I should have I brought some piece of flint or obsidian and shown you, because it's really hard for us to imagine how many sequences in the future and how radically, especially for something like an Acheulean tool, you have to envision iterative steps, and each time you have to re-envision them because you've changed the platform. So there are many other examples, but the stone tool is a good one because people have tried to teach some of the smartest, most human-like chimpanzees to make stone tools, and we can't do it. What we did learn, and chimps are incredibly smart, Kanzi, people tried to teach him how to make stone tools. What Kanzi learned really quickly is that we wanted him to make some sharp-edged rocks. So finally, he just went to the highest place and started breaking all the rocks and brought people edges, which is really smart, but it's not creating stone tools.
I have another one for you. Given the expensive nature of human imagination, our restructure of human imagination, restructuring the environment, notably accelerating species extinctions and emerging technologies in the end, is the end of the nature as we have inherited it inevitable?
So let me back up for 1 second and go back to stone tools, because one of the things we have to think about is what's called niche construction. So humans are very, very good at dealing with the pressures of the world by actually changing those pressures, right? Which then changes the way we interface with the world. So rather than thinking of the environment just affecting organisms, think about organisms and the environment in a mutual dance, co-shaping and reshaping one another. In the human context, what we've become especially good at we've been doing this for a couple million years, but in the last many thousand years, let's say 5 to 10, 15,000 years, we become really, really good at re-engineering, reconstructing other species and landscapes for our own benefit. Now, that's had a lot of cascade effects. Frequently, when we change one component in the environment, other components come back to bite us in the butt. And so we then reconfigure that. So this back and forth is what humans do. That's how we made it in the world. Imagination plays a critical role in that. Now, what we've found in contemporary times, and we can go back and look at this in many contexts, we find that in many cases humans exceed, manipulate, or erroneously assume some manipulation is going to have a positive effect. And we see humans correcting for that, but we also see lots of human populations going extinct. Remember, most human populations for the history of our genus have gone extinct. Right? We now are doing something, we as humans and what we do are causing one of the largest extinction events in the history of our planet. But we know that we're doing it. Well, We all know, most people don't admit it. But we also know what those processes are. So is it too late? No, it's not too late. It is not too late. We're not going to fall off and break the world, but we are breaking many, many, many ecosystems. And so using imagination and using this collaboration and compassion and this ability to sort of think both technologically and socially through issues, we know as many problems that we're causing ecologically. We also have the knowledge to address a vast majority of those. Do we have the will? Do we have the imagination? And do we have the endurance? That's another question.
Sheldon, maybe you should come. Because I see the time, maybe you should ask some from your pool.
A question for Lyra. So, are there any known languages or cultures that don't use metaphor?
That's a really interesting question. So languages, of course, have a finite set of words, and we have an infinite set of situations we want to talk about. So, in fact, there isn't a way to avoid using metaphor whenever you're talking, right? You're always going to be extending prior uses of words in slightly new context. Some of those extensions will strike you as more metaphorical, some will strike you as more mundane, but in fact we're always stretching and pushing the boundaries of language. And the way I think about the dictionary is that it's basically a retirement home for metaphors, right? Once a metaphor has gotten conventionalized enough that you don't hear it as a novel use anymore. It kind of goes and retires and becomes a meaning in the dictionary. But really, you're always extending words. One exercise I give to my students is just to take any article in the New York Times, take the front page of the New York Times, and go through and try to underline everything that's a metaphor. And it's really hard to get through a sentence without finding a metaphor. And once you start adding in spatial prepositions, like if someone says it arrived on time, well, that's a spatial word that we're using for time. Is that a metaphor? Once you get caught up in that, you're basically underlining every word in the New York Times as a metaphor. And it just gives you that sense of how hard it is to actually tell what is the literal meaning, because you're always using words in new contexts and you're always pushing the boundaries. That's the nature of language.
Great. And another question for you. So in the work you've been doing looking at time, have you looked at when children start to have a sense of time? And if so, is there anything about how they map directions of time and space before they learn reading and writing, for example?
It's a wonderful question. Of course, there are many different things that we mean by time. There's a judgment of duration or a sense of duration, but then there are also more abstract things like the idea of tomorrow. A word like tomorrow is hard to learn because you never see tomorrow. People always talk about tomorrow, but not when tomorrow is around. It's never around, right? So how do you figure out what that means? It takes a little while. So it does take kids a little while to figure out these temporal terms. Kids do start to organize things according to the directions that are prevalent in their culture before they start reading and writing themselves. And partially that's because of how much their parents do that kind of organizing for them, right? So even if you yourself are not reading, your parent is likely reading to you and pointing things out to you in a particular direction. And all kinds of things in your household are going to be arranged that way. And so there are going to be all these cultural practices that drive exploration in a particular direction from left to right. You'll be asked to line up in lines from left to right and all kinds of other things. So that's a cultural practice that permeates lots and lots of other things that then start to predate reading and writing.
Great, thank you. I have some other questions. Got questions for Polly about, can you come on up? So one thing you were starting to get to at the end of your talk was looking at Arctic societies, and a question comes up about whether or not they spend more time telling stories in the long winter nights.
Okay, I'll get to that. First, I wanted to...
Talk in
First, I want to make a correction. This has nothing to do with pockets. This is a picture from the New Guinea Highlands where it's very cold in the morning, and this is what we call the Highlands overcoat. That's what it is. Anyway, yes, in the Arctic, I've looked through many Arctic societies, and like the Tinglet, they will tell stories for 3 or 4 days going. They will build fires that are 6 feet high. They will sit around, and then in between they'll sleep a bit, and they'll continue for days on end. So yes, in those areas. And of course, they also have very elaborate social networks to remember kinship systems, because there's very high risk in the Arctic. So yes.
Okay, and then another question. Any of the societies that you've looked at utilize any neurochemical augmentation as a part of their storytelling rituals?
Okay, none of the societies I've looked at do. The Bushmen go into trance, so actually when they're in trance, and sometimes they go into trance when telling stories, it's completely done without any neurochemical augmentation whatsoever, and yet when you see them trance, sometimes they fall in the fire and they're burning and they don't even feel it, and then somebody else will say, hey, get your arm out of the fire. And so they really get into a very, very intense altered state of consciousness. It's very painful to go into this, but it's done without drugs. There are a lot of societies that use drugs too, but not usually with storytelling, unless a bit of marijuana.
Thank you. Allison, a couple questions for you. And actually we have a cluster of questions that are somewhat related, and they have to do with 23andMe analyses of people's DNA, and coming back, and I'm 9% Neanderthal, I'm blah, blah, blah. And so are you at the point where you're able to look at what this kind of latent Neanderthal DNA is in humans, and is any of that related to neurological development?
Yeah, that's a great question that was heavily discussed in another CARTA meeting on genetic origins of the Neanderthals. So there's a fraction of the human population, most Europeans, who actually have a small part of Neanderthal genome. And yeah, companies like 23andMe have making claims that they can detect the fraction or how much you have. It's not a lot. It varies between 2 and 4%. And everybody has is slightly different. It's not that everybody has the same. Pieces of those or fragments of those Neanderthal DNAs have been linked to human conditions, both positive or negative. Right now, I mean, other than that, it's all very correlational. There are some studies that are trying to make a point for why this was positively selected in humans, why we still have them. But I think experimental validations, such as recreating these networks in a dish, even for other tissues, is still in the early stages. So there is not much we can say except for correlation. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess another category of interest has to do with things like when you're working with this kind of human origin work and in a very wet way with the actual genomes, what kind of oversight is there for this research, or where, what do you think are the kind of even the underlying ethics of doing work with DNA? And it maybe not only applies to this work, but we can think of it in kind of a broader context of, everything that we're now able to do with CRISPR technology and the kinds of genetic engineering that is viable now, that's just kind of extraordinary. So what are your thoughts about that?
So this is a very early field, and especially for the brain, it always raises a little bit more red flags than other tissue. Nobody complains when you make like a mini gut in a dish, but if you say you have a mini brain, people, oh, mini brain. So, and so far, we have been away from any ethical controversies, mainly because those mini brains never show an activity level similar to something, I mean, like a human brain, a baby. Most of the work before what I show you has been doing that by gene expression, and that's a little bit tricky because you are always compared to a postmortem brain. Now that we're showing real activity and you're actually plugging that into a robot or even in other tissue that can actually experience the world, that becomes a little bit more problematic. I think people are, and scientists are aware that this might create some concerns in part of the society, but nonetheless, I mean, we are doing that to answer fundamental questions, and my lab focuses on neurological disorders, so the aim is good. Same rationale could be applied for genome editing, right? I mean, we have now this possibility to modify genomes. We can go to an embryo and fix a terrible mutation that person will have for the rest of his life. But what about if you start using this genome editing to create people that are taller or have blue eyes or are more intelligent, if you figure out what is the biological basis of that? So it's up to the society to put a threshold. In my experience, I think most scientists would agree with that. Is in the beginning of a new technology, there will always some turmoil about what are the consequences of that. But this is slowly will go away as the science shows how useful are those. So the same thing for blood transfusion, for organ transplant. So they all raise red flags, and now we do it quite common to do it. So I think the idea of brain organoid and genome editing will pass through some kind of moratorium, and we'll know what's possible, what's not, what's dangerous, what's not, and we will regulate from there.
Yeah, it's great. I think the work is in this state where it's like just tremendously evocative. It's very novel for people to hear about, and then you put it in a robot, and I think, and maybe the robot has like lasers and buzzsaws on it or something. And so that maybe kind of raises some questions. But I think for all of this, it is this idea that, we do bring our imaginations, and that the work that everybody's doing is kind of stimulating us to kind of rethink, what our humanity is, what it consists of, and when we try to think about where it's coming from, it's definitely with an idea to think about where is it going. And and we hear many things about, this is how we see imagination happening in childhood. This is how we see it happening in other species. This is the kind of condition of humanity that leads us to kind of have this genetic and cultural coevolution that are, bound together in ways that have gotten us to this point. And that if we're going to get to the next point, that this kind of cultivation, understanding, and harnessing of the human imagination in an even more effective coevolutionary way is probably the thing that's going to save our behinds. Okay. So I think the work that you're doing, not only to look at how this works to address neurological disorders that we know are kind of a real scourge of humanity, but what comes with Humanity 2.0 is a kind of important thing. So I think, do you have another set of questions?
I have some for Morris. Welcome. So in terms of human evolution, and especially migration, is the imagination always a positive force? And if so, how does it come to be overcoming in the process of considering the fears from which the first humans must have lived. I think the question is about if imagination is always positive, we have to first conquer our fears to imagine something and try, right?
I'm not sure if it's always positive, but what I was trying to say is that no human society can continue without, or at least would be completely different, if we didn't have this level of social imagination. Our society would be just like that of the chimpanzees, where it is a matter of interpersonal relationships, while the question for humans is how you get beyond interpersonal relationships to get much bigger groups. You see, interpersonal relationships in the end limit the size of the group to the number of people you can have interpersonal relationships with, obviously. So I don't think it's dangerous, but the kind of societies that would be produced we probably wouldn't even recognize them, and it wouldn't get very far. I would have thought they would have been wiped out years ago. They'd just be small and yeah.
I have another one for you.
Right.
Take the idea of constructs of human grouping and take it further. Do you see ramifications towards symbolic interactions and towards structural anthropogeny as direct consequences?
I don't very much like the term symbolic, because, and I could explain it in a simple way. Several people have talked about pretend play. Now, it's very clear that in pretend play, children understand that it is pretense. They laugh at the pretense, unlike Piaget, who just thought it just got muddled. So children have this area which they think is symbolic, but they're conscious of it not being true. On the other hand, the kind of imagination that takes place when people think, that their national identity or their clan are objects almost like mountains in the world. They're not, in a sense, imaginary. This seems to be completely different. And so the reason why I don't like the term symbolic is that it muddles these two things together. It muddles what we're conscious of as a symbol, and what is probably much more important, we think of as just true.
All right. I think that's it. I would like to thank you all for sticking around. Do you have something?
Before I thank everyone, Karen Walker wanted to correct something briefly. Brief.
I do. Okay, so I don't know how many of you caught this. When you're standing up here with the lights and everything, it's very disorienting. So I was doing this counterfactual reasoning about my answer to your questions. Somebody asked me about neonatal imitation, which is way different from prenatal imitation, which is the thing that I actually answered about. So neonatal imitation is the thing that happens after you're born, where if you look at a brand new baby and you stick your tongue out, they'll stick their tongue out back at you, right? This is a really different kind of thing than the thing I thought you were asking about. So the question here is, that kind of imitation, is that somehow grounded in imagination? And I still don't know the answer, but it's sort of a different workaround answer, which is that neonatal imitation we think of mostly as a social reflex. It's something that happens immediately after birth. And what it does is it sort of paves the way for all of the rest of social cognition to come on board, right? Attention to faces, following gaze, doing this kind of imitation which makes your caregiver love you a little bit more, right? All of these things are really important for fostering social connection. And so that later becomes complicated things like theory of mind, which absolutely involve imagining the perspective of other people. So anyway, I would say that neonatal imitation is related to imagination, but in a sort of long trajectory as opposed to sort of immediate. So anyway, I apologize for my error. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So with that, I'd like to thank you all, thank our two chairs, all our speakers, the audience here and out in space, and all the many people who have continued supporting CARTA. I would invite you all to support CARTA. And I very much hope that we will see you again at the upcoming symposia. Hopefully we'll see you at some of these events. And again, thank you all. Thank all the people for making possible the recordings and the streaming of this event. Have a good one.